if we can get past our own individual selves and think about the whole collective of our individual contributions, we can rise above and see the greatest impact that we ever could. But we got to be okay with maybe we don't always lead, or maybe we're not always in the center. But there's a time for you to be in the driver's seat, and then there's sometimes it's okay to be in the back seat.
Esther, who are we talking today and why are you so excited?
I am so excited because we're talking to Pamela Garmon Johnson, who is one of the leaders of the American Heart Association, which, for those of you that aren't familiar and listening or watching, is one of the most visible nonprofits in the country dedicated to bringing awareness to and fighting with research and collaboration heart disease. So Pamela has been with American Heart Association for 25 years and is going to share her experience.
Let's get to the show. Pamela, welcome. We are truly honored to have you here today. Thank you for giving us some of your time. We know you usually have a very packed schedule. For our listeners, you are a very inspirational leader. And so when we have individuals like yourself, I think Esther and I both get a little giddy, and especially ones we were talking a little bit before we started here, especially those that like to talk and to tell stories. And so we're excited to get into your background personally, and also your professional career, especially the work that you're doing to achieve health equity. And so for the folks that are listening, I think the American Heart Association, most people might know those three words together, but they might not know exactly what the American Heart Association does. And so if you wouldn't mind, maybe just giving us a little insight into your organization, the mission, and then specifically the role that you lead.
Well, the American Heart Association, our primary focus is on reducing the risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke. And we contribute to that in many ways. One is through research. That is where the majority of our resources go, is to research. We also advocate. We advocate for legislation that can improve one's health. And then also the work that we do at the community level with individuals, and and then also to educate the public with evidence-based information. There's a lot of information out there about, how you can live a healthier life, but is it from a credible source? And I really am proud to work for the American Heart Association, one that has a 99% brand recognition, and one that really represents what I believe is critical to um, improving one's health, and doing it from a space that looks at all components of what impacts a person's life.
And so as we talk to leaders on this podcast from different sectors, we usually like to break it down into two big functions. One, who is the individual that we're talking to, their origin story, where do they come from, the communities that they come from. And we really want to talk to you about not only that hometown and really get into the weeds there, but also talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you have faced, both through your younger years, your college years, maybe your professional years. That adversity or that time where you had to show some grit is usually a common theme we see across leaders that have just done very, very well. There's an inner drive that maybe not others share. So walk us a little bit through your unique story, both from growing up to college years. I did notice from a little bit of LinkedIn stalking that you started off as an accountant. And then how did you get into the role that you're in now?
Oh my goodness. So let me just kind of set the stage for where this all began. I grew up in a very small town, Henderson, Texas, which is in East Texas, about 2 hours east of Dallas, Texas. an hour west of Shreveport, Louisiana. And in this small town, my parents owned a funeral home. And so I grew up in an environment of having parents that were entrepreneurs. And what I saw from them was that they worked together. And I saw the importance of, I didn't know that it was called this then, but teamwork. But my parents were a team. And I saw them working
Hmm.
together, and I saw them working really hard to overcome so many challenges and then of being in a small town. But then also, my parents were somewhat of an anomaly from the standpoint they owned their own business. My dad was a World War II vet. He received a Purple Heart. My parents were older parents. They had us later in life. There's three of us. I have my sister and then my brother, who's the youngest. And we grew up working in the business.
Hmm.
What does that mean? That means that we had to be cordial to everyone. We had to write out receipts for when people brought their insurance money. I was exposed to people not knowing how to read and them signing documents with an X. And also watching how the community trusted my parents with their innermost secrets and aspirations. And they looked for them because they trusted them. And I understood as I've gotten older the importance of that because it really shaped who I am, who my sister is, and who my brother is today. Because the characteristics of having grit, understanding community, understanding business, understanding that there are a multitude of ways to solve problems came from growing up in that environment. And I will say for me that it was difficult for me because once I got to a certain age, I was placed in, quote, at the time they were called gifted classes. And so I was separated out as the only African American in those classes. And it was hard because you were in an environment where, we're all trying to learn and understand, but I stood out because there was only a handful of people that their parents even had college degrees.
Hmm.
And my parents both had college degrees, even at their age. So you have to think that I was a second generation, was going to be a second generation college graduate where the students that I was in these classes with, their parents were millionaires because
Hmm.
you have to keep in mind rural East Texas was oil
Oil
country.
country. Yep.
And so, but though that's who I went to school with. And so as I matriculated through school, I was in the same class with the same individuals all the way through high school, which actually it was okay in high school. What I learned was that many of those students that I was in class with had access to things that I did not have access to.
Hmm.
Access to tests because their siblings were ahead. I was the oldest in my family, but they had access to all those things. So when I studied with them, I was like, oh my goodness. And I didn't understand what that meant at the time, but where I am now, that is the privilege of being at that table. And that is what truly causes the inequities.
Yep.
I will also say that being in this town, the influence that money and influence has, and who knows who, it just gets magnified in larger cities, but it's still the same even in small towns.
Yeah.
And it's so political, it's so incredibly political. And you have to learn how to navigate. But I was always a voice for equity. My parents were truly the foundation of us, my siblings and I, realizing who we could be. They never gave us an out for anything, nothing. No matter how bad it got or us not being accepted in circles, they never let that be an out. And they were like, well, you still got to do it. So
Hmm.
you're going to have to get up and do it. That's what they would say. It's like, but it's so hard, but they didn't care because at the end of the day, the adversity that they faced was far greater than whatever little adversity I was going through. And my parents provided us each an education. They paid for it. I didn't have to come out of college with any debt. My siblings did not. So I am for that. I am eternally grateful for that. So this little black girl from Henderson, Texas, she cares because I saw my parents care. I saw them care about their community. And the one last thing I want to share is, you know, when people come to you at their quote darkest hour because they've lost a loved one, you see the good and you see the ugly. But my parents' ability to navigate and negotiate with families to see that you need to come together right now because this is what is best for your family was also, I saw that modeled for me in many ways. And I also saw that my parents knew that those that didn't have access, they were committed to helping them have access. That was to food, that was to legal advice, to tax advice. That's what my parents did. And so this work that we're doing in health equity, whatever, they didn't have those words then, right? But that is what they demonstrated for each of us.
The one question I do have regarding that is that when did you actually acknowledge the appreciation that you had? Was it something that you saw all along as a kid, or is it something that you saw maybe as you took that first role as an accountant, or until you got to the American Heart Association?
I think the impact of of them on my life was in different phases. So going to college and being quote a second generation person attending college was an anomaly. Second was, when I started working as an accountant and being in that environment, I learned a lot about myself because I recognized I could not do that for the rest of my life. I
Hmm.
was like, I cannot do this. I mean, I love numbers, I love the analytics, but just sitting there every month doing the same thing, closing out the books. Oh my gosh.
So let's talk. Actually, let's talk about
I
that.
was
Let's
like,
talk
I
about that
can't do this.
transition. So I think a lot of
Okay, I'm
people,
happy to talk
and this
about
is,
it.
and this, well, this is an area that I think goes throughout your career. But there's some pieces around having the courage to recognize, hey, maybe this isn't the path I want to go down. I know a lot of folks that have stuck in careers that weren't necessarily their passion, or they realized that early on, but they were worried about making a mistake, so they just stuck with it. Talk about that transition when you made the decision to leave the accounting field, and then your early days at the American Heart Association. Like how did that even come up? And then what were the first things that you were working on? Because you've been there for, and congratulations, 25 years.
I have. I definitely have 25 years. And so I'll talk about that transition. My parents, when I said, I can't do this anymore, and my parents were like, you're going to live a good paying job. I was like, I don't care if it is a good paying job. I cannot do this anymore. And I was like, I can't. So what I did was say, what do I like? What am I passionate about? And interestingly enough, there was two things that happened. a really good friend of mine that went to A&M, he said to me, Pamela, you need to go back and get your MBA and focus on the business aspect of um, of anything that you want to do. But you need that because it will help you explore different opportunities. Well, at the same time, I applied, I got in because he was actually in the program too. It was a part time program. Because it was like, well, I can't afford to just quit and like not work. My parents paid for my first degree, but they're not going to pay for the second one. So I got to do, I got to figure this out. So I applied to the American Heart Association and I applied to this other company. And I was like, you know what? The majority of my mom's family, they all have some issue around heart disease. Be it hypertension, being overweight, diabetes, having amputations. I was like, you know what? Maybe I can do good here. And so I accepted a position because of Walter Bristol, who was at the time the he was the vice president of finance and then became our CFO. But he took a chance on me, and I started at American Heart at the same time I started my MBA program at SMU. So I was going to school and learning a new job. In that first year, my boss was like, "This is not for you." I was like, "It's not." We were so polar opposites. And the thing is, she's still at American Heart, and we're like, we still have a great relationship and all of that. But she knew, and I knew too, this was not it. So she actually helped me to explore other areas at the AHA. And then a young lady, Alicia Owens. Alicia was the HR person. She also was like, Pamela, you need to start networking within the organization. I was like, networking? What do you mean by all of that? I didn't know. Like, no one taught me what networking was, but that was my first glimpse into it.
I'm curious, in those 25 years, how did you see the American Heart Association think differently about addressing heart disease and publicizing heart disease in all populations? And I ask this because my mom is a cardiologist, and so she spent a long time, on women's heart disease and working with the AHA on the very, very important work that you all have done on making sure that women understand the risks and appreciate that heart disease is an equal opportunity disease, unfortunately. So, and that's one small portion of the work that you all have done. So maybe just a little bit. How has that changed over the last 25 years? What have you seen sort of, in that time?
Well, you want to see my gray hair? Because that's what it's taken. Just kidding. But you know what? I will say, we had a committee that was called the Women and Minority Leadership Committee. So once I moved up in the organization and I was like at a managerial level, I actually got to start going to committee meetings. And that's where I started to be exposed to like how strategy is thought about, how you communicate strategy, and to your point, to sell in a vision. And so I saw the numbers. It was the data. The data said that we had these disparities in women. We had disparities among people of color. We had disparities among those that were at a certain socioeconomic level. And so it really made me realize, well, why are we spending resources where there's not a need? Like, they're here. So why would we continue to spend resources here and we can't move the needle much? So this is my accounting, the analytics of me. And so I began to work on projects that focused on hypertension at the time, diabetes, and cholesterol. And we talked about disparities. That was the first time I had been exposed to, like, quote, healthcare disparities. Again, there was no health equity language at the time. So, talking about the numbers and how do we close these gaps if we were going to realize our goals. So, over the years, the AHA began to shift to say, if we're going to make an impact, where can we have our greatest impact? And so we were seeing improvement in numbers, right? Like we would set a goal, like our 2010 goal, we hit it, right? Our 2020 goal, we did not. But that's because the disparities finally overshadowed and outweighed the numbers, the positive numbers that we're seeing in other populations. So that truly was the catalyst, was us not achieving that 2020 goal and understanding the why. So even though we may have been speaking about this is why we can't achieve these goals, but until there was research and the evidence to say that the social determinants of health were the key drivers of a person's health outcomes, did we get to a place that we were really truly focused on health equity. And we had so many starts and stops. We did, because for those of us like you that have been working in this space, the expectation is that you're going to make transformative impact in a year. But that's
Mhm.
not how it works, because you didn't get to these numbers in a year either. You're talking about 50 plus years, and then it just all became a snowball effect. Hence, COVID exposed that. And then bam. So we had to put some metrics in place to say, how do we have incremental change that can get us to that transformative change? And then how do you start to scale? And, we're also one that we want to scale quickly, right? We do. I mean, it's who we are as an organization. But we also have to ensure that we have the right infrastructure to scale. And that's one of like the key learnings for me, even on the work that I'm doing right now. You have to have the right infrastructure. So for me, that is just a look back to present day, the infrastructure, the right people in the right seats. That's what's going to help you fuel yourselves getting to the outcome that you need.
Yeah, and I think you said something that Taylor and I talk about a lot, which is that combination of analytics and creativity, and how that's sort of what fueled your growth. It wasn't enough to have just the analytics and finance, right? And then you got to the creative side and you're like, this is great, but I want to see the data, and that's how I'm going to decide the vision. So maybe just talk to us a little bit about how you think about that combination, because it's obviously in you. It's part of what made you a success, and it's part of what has made the HA a success. So how do you think about that combination of those two qualities or skills?
I'm always reminding the team to say data informs strategy. So a lot of organizations, a lot of corporations, they mean so well. They have the best intent. But if we're not listening and understanding what is being said to us from a qualitative standpoint, and then also understanding the data and marrying those two to formulate our strategies, we're going to have a miss. And it is really hard, because each person is so passionate about whatever component that they own. So they want that piece to be like the center, right? But what I've tried to communicate and try to convey and try to demonstrate, that is no one thing that's going to be at the center except for the individual and the community. So if you pull on all these levers at the same time, that is when we're going to have impact. So that is what I have learned. We do this work over here in the healthcare setting, you do the work over here in the community, but you never marry it all together. That's been part of the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
No one got married as a part of the process. And, I present quite a bit to different boards and things like that. And I said, right now, if we don't all band together and recognize that we're going to have to work together as a team, our country will be in the exact same situation that it's in now or worse in the next 10 years. So it is incumbent upon us to recognize that and be okay that your work may not be at the center,
Mm-hmm.
but just think about if it's a W, it's a W. It's a win, right? It is a win because we're a team. That is I think that part is the hardest part, regardless of what project, what social organization we may be involved in, what civic organization. It's if we can get past our own individual selves and think about the whole collective of our individual contributions, we can rise above and see the greatest impact that we ever could, but we got to be okay with maybe we don't always lead or maybe we're not always in the center. But there's a time for you to be in the driver's seat, and then there's sometimes it's okay to be in the back seat. But at some point, you get to be in the driver's seat. And so when you have that driver's seat, go as far as you can and continue to innovate, but then bring others along because you're going to need them because you do not have enough resources to do it by yourself.
I mean, I feel like you've been sitting in some of our meetings, listening to how we talk about this work as well, because, not to be cliche, but this work definitely takes a village. And, I couldn't agree more that everybody has to be on the same page. And you mentioned a little bit about your organization of not only having the right talent on the team, but also in the right seats. That goes for some of these large partnerships. But in that, you deal with a lot of, how do I say this in a non-negative way? There's challenges associated to personalities, especially when you're working with outside organizations, and especially with organizations that have name brands that could be on par with American Heart Association or commercial entities or state governments, and everybody innately wants to lead. They think they have the best idea. They think that they want to control or run a process. Walk through a little bit about how you manage that both as a leader, just personally, and then how you manage your team through it. Because we deal with that a lot here as well. We've been at this for 10 years. We hear all the buzz terms. Our first 5 years, we only focused on the veteran military population. We didn't even know what social determinants of health were when it came out in 2018, or someone explained it to us. Maybe it came out before then, because the community never called it that. Similar to your what you were explaining back when you were growing up, like it wasn't called health equity. You didn't know the disparities that were there. But then we put a professional term to it, and everyone starts to rally around this, and now everybody and their mom is in social determinants of health. Everybody has a health equity initiative, whether they're doing it tactically on the ground, like really hardcore work, or they're just taking advantage of the marketing buzz. How do you manage that as a leader, really pushing your organization, but also continuing to keep your team motivated?
One thing that I will pride myself on is I've had a gift of being able to work with other organizations, and that gift has been centered around being able to listen and not overcommit about what we could do together, but to identify here's where we can start. Let's start somewhere because we can't boil the ocean. And so once you start working with an organization and you identify that maybe the one thing that you're going to work on together, you have success, you move on to the next thing that you want to tackle together, you have a success. And what happens is you have a trusted partner and they're willing to go on a journey. You're willing to go on a journey together because what you see is oh, this is my lane and this is their lane. They're not trying to get in my lane, and I'm not trying to get in their lane. We have our own lanes, but we're
Yeah.
going to the same destination. And it does not happen up front. It doesn't. But that is what I have found. And I can tell you the relationships that we have garnered is because of that. It's the listening, it's having those wins together. And it's not, it's like we don't say, well, it was the American Heart Association. No, we give credit to our partners. We did this together. And being able to present that to, our executive leadership, um, they have respected that. And when I look at our guiding values, meeting people where they are, building powerful partnerships, speaking with a trustworthy voice, that is how, from my career, how I've gotten to where I am today. So I'm just living out what those guiding values are that are also my own personal guiding values. And when I look at the longevity of some of our relationships that we've had, that is what I uplift to my team. Don't be tone deaf. We just heard who ex-partners say this. So if we know that that is their pain point, then how can we contribute to solving that pain point? When you remove a barrier for an organization or an individual, let me tell you, you you can pick up the phone and call them. And that's from presidents of organizations, CEOs, um, chief medical officers that have been, my mentors. I listen. And that's what I really ensure that my team does is they listen. And I do push back. I'm like, but that's not what the data says, and that's not what they said. So going back and presenting something that looks nothing like what they talked about, that's not going to have a good end result. And so it's just not going to. And so I model it. I train on that with my team. And I'll just say that it is probably it being able to build relationships and partnerships and nourish them and grow them, to have positive impact is one of my greatest strengths. And I really am. It's something that I'm very, very proud of. And I don't take lightly. I don't think partnership is something to ever take lightly. And when we fall short, we also have to say we fell short on this. And it's okay to say that you know, we made a misstep. People appreciate transparency, but
Hmm.
that goes along with building the trust.
Yeah, I think that's so well put because I do think that when you have a trust relationship, what that means is good and bad. So, I can share the successes and you can talk about the challenges together and push through them. So, I think that's I think we work through a lot of that here and
Which is it's 100% certainty. I mean, you mentioned it earlier. Decades upon decades of inefficiencies or
yeah.
lack of focus on certain communities or social care or populations. There's no way to unravel all of that in 12 months. And especially when you're going to be a trailblazer and a bunch of organizations that are coming together, that in and of itself, you're gonna run into roadblocks and challenges, and I call them sometimes 3-foot hurdles, 6-foot hurdles, or a couple mountains that you either got to go over or go around. But I don't know at times if partners in the very beginning realize like, oh, we're gonna hit some headwinds here, and I think that transparency of one knowing you're gonna hit them, two hitting them together, and there's a unifying motivation there at times. If you set the stage appropriate, it's like, oh no, we expected this. Here we go. Setting that stage early and having that open conversation is paramount. And to your point, sometimes that takes a little while because not all organizations are wired that way. And so I'd love to just get your view a little bit more around your current role. And if there was one thing that if anybody listening here were to walk away from, generally about your work, about the American Heart Association, about health equity in general, like what should people walk away from, or what would you want them to walk away from knowing about, again, health equity, your work, or the American Heart Association?
That's a really good question from the standpoint that I know that it's not one thing. What I know is that we have the opportunity to find how we can contribute to addressing these major issues in our society. So if your focus is on hunger, or if it's focused on homelessness, if it's focused on access to quality care, find your niche in that construct and help to move those organizations forward. Because at the end of the day, as my pastor says, it's like a quilt. If you work on your patch and then this other person works on their patch and this group works on their patch, finally all the patches come together to make this beautiful quilt. To me, that is what is necessary. But you got to give. And it's you have to give. You have to give in your purpose. You use the strengths and your passion towards solving a problem, but stay focused. Stay focused in it for the long haul. To me, that is what is the thing that we can make the biggest difference in our society, quite frankly. And I think in some ways, I mean, the quilt is the best example.
Mm-hmm.
We would have a beautiful picture, a beautiful society if we could do that.
I think we just found our podcast title. I think we could put that together of Pamela talking about the need for everybody to build a quilt, but own their square. I think that's really well put, and I think again it goes back to like helping people visualize how they fit into the greater good here, and people really owning their lanes. I think that's great advice for organizations, regardless of what sector that they're in, of being able to own their piece, and then partnering with those other organizations that they know they're going to own their piece too. So I really appreciate you breaking that down.
And I love how you talked about, being in it for the long haul and, getting through everything and knowing that there's longevity. And we always like to ask our guests for longevity, and the AHA is 98 years old this year. Is it about the mission and the brand, or is it about the people? Which do you think?
From my perspective, it's about the people, because we enable the mission. And so each of us have our own stories. That's why you do have such longevity at the AHA with many staff. It's because we're passionate. And so we give relentlessly to the work. And therefore, it does fuel the mission. It's fueled our focus on health equity because there were a lot of passionate volunteers that said, we keep talking about it, but we got to do something about it. And so health equity is not about a department. Health equity is about all the work that we do. So again, thinking about the piece of the quilt, each of us are working on a component, and in that we should be addressing the disparities that exist, because then if you do, over time you start to close those gaps. I know for some that can be difficult because they're like, oh my gosh, it's just such a daunting task. It's daunting. But it really isn't, because it's just like walking, right? Like you crawl before you walk. And so we crawled and then we started walking. Now we're running. Like we're running, and we're connecting the right pieces, we're getting the insights, and we're validating the work as we move along, and we're ensuring that we have those voices at the table. Like, we like to hear that from others outside of the AHA, to give a nod to, it is so great to see that you're working with this group and this group and this group. That has, we somehow will say, well, you forgot about this group. It, in the journey of equity, you try to be inclusive, and which sometimes can be challenging. However, and what I mean by that is that at some point you have to go with the strategies that enable you to have the greatest impact to address the greatest disparity.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens once you do that, the smaller disparities will start to get smaller and smaller too. But you need those bigger strategies, and you gotta stay focused. And we, all of us don't have the patience to go through that process, but it's what I love.
Mm-hmm.
The startup, the pulling the pieces and connecting the dots is what I love, but that is not for everybody. And probably right now, with the project I'm working on now, of having very black and white people, like, it's just like, well, it's this, and then you got to convince them that, but there's some other things, there is a gray area here, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to think about the gray area, because over here we're learning this. So even though this is what how are you going to take this information and inform what you're doing? That has probably been the most difficult, one of the most difficult challenges I think I've had to deal with, is bringing others along, especially when you're a visionary and then they're on the tail end
Mm-hmm.
of the curve, and they're slowly coming along. Whew, that part is the hardest. But you walk in, I try to walk in with a positive attitude and think about everything as an opportunity, not a deficit. And to me, that's my responsibility as a leader. And I have to model that, like, no matter how, oh, this could be, it could be a negative, but what did we learn from it?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, what did we learn from it, so that this next time we can capitalize on the knowledge to move further and past that.
Well, Pamela, it's been a pleasure. I think what you've been able to accomplish in your 25 years so far, and obviously you're not done, but you talk about the crawl, walk, run phase, and this country's in a very unique situation where finally, I think you have government, you have nonprofit, you have for-profit, healthcare, all realizing the importance of social determinants of health equity. But it's going to take leaders like yourself that know when to lead, know when to follow, but also bring folks underneath the tent to start making some pretty hard decisions, because I don't want this moment to pass us up. And I feel very confident and excited when I talk with individuals like yourself that I feel like have the right approach to understand of how to bring all of these different views and different sectors to the table to really make transformational change, to really get out there and create an environment where everyone has access to the care that they need, regardless if it's health, human, or social. And they feel comfortable asking for that help in their communities and from their leaders. So I really appreciate your time today, sharing both your personal journey and your professional experiences. And I think we have a lot here that people are going to digest, and I can't wait for them to hear it. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. And can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
Because I think I will walk away and feel remorseful for not saying this. And that is, there were, over the last couple of years, I have been interviewed about a lot of different things about my life personally, about my professional career. But there's two things that I feel like that I have shared that I want to share here. One is that what got us here? What got corporations, nonprofits, government saying we've got to do something? And that is the death of George Floyd and us being at home during COVID was the it was the turning point in our country. And so I would be so remorseful if I did not lift that up, because it was at that time that it was like we finally had the conversations that we all for some reason felt like we couldn't have.
Hmm.
But if we don't talk to each other and communicate, we can't move forward in a positive way. So they're not hard. I mean, they may be hard conversations, but if you just listen and have some empathy, big word,
Hmm.
regardless on what seat that you sit, you as a leader, you can be a leader in whatever seat. I just told my team that. Doesn't matter about what title or whatever, but you have a lot of power in your everyday decisions. And the second thing I want to share is that I'm usually asked, what is the one thing that a person can do to help make our society better? I said, have a friend that does not look like you. And
Hmm.
I'm not talking about somebody that you work with. I'm talking about a person that they come to your house, you go to their house, you break bread together. Like that is a friend. Like they know who's in your family.
Hmm.
That is a friend. I said, if each one of us did that, oh my goodness, we would have just so many other perspectives than whatever we see on TV, hear, see on social media. We would just have different perspectives. And that perspective is that we all want the same thing, the best life for ourselves. So, with that, thank you so much for the opportunity. I am so grateful to be asked to be a part of this podcast. And I'm glad to be able to share my story. And I hope that it can positively impact another young person that is from a small town, a major city, to think about what they can do with their power to make an impact on our society.
Thank you so much.
Well, damn! I'm so glad you interrupted us. It said no. I want to put this in there because that was beautiful. No, it was great because it is one of those things where there are things that are catalysts to drive conversation, and then it comes back to relationships, regardless of who that individual on the other side is, and having those conversations. And no, that was wonderful. Thank you.